So, Mike, there's a AI tool called Pi AI, right? And
Yes.
it was created by a company called Inflection, designed to be a kind of shoulder to cry on for people, meant to be kind of empathetic AI, right?
I cry
Now,
on its shoulder all the time.
I thought that's what this podcast was for. Um, but I'm going to give you what it says on the kind of homepage screen from when I access Pi AI, okay? So this is what it says. It says, take your time and know that I'm here to listen. What's been happening?
Well, Ben, thank you. Thank you for listening to me. What has been happening this week, it seems, is that courts have been throwing out big, important rulings left and right and keeping me very, very busy. So now take your time and know that I am here to listen as well, Ben. What is happening with you?
I have been following along to the new reviews that we've got to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. On the back of your plea last week, Mike, we've had
Yes.
listeners respond in their droves, or at least in a few cases, and really grateful for that. So that's been this week, and we'll talk more about that in today's episode. Hello, and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. This week's episode is brought to you with the financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything Moderation, a weekly newsletter about online speech and content moderation. And I'm joined by the founder and editor of Tech Dirt, Mike Masnick. Mike, you're here, you're listening. What would I do without you, eh? Without our weekly recordings.
I'm not an AI yet. I'm sometimes accused of being an AI.
There could be Mike AI, couldn't there?
Yeah.
Is there a chat GPT with all of the Tech Dirt articles from the past 20 odd years in it yet?
I mean, I assume that somehow they've been sucked up into all the different AI systems. I did have one organization reach out to me and say that they would create a Tech Dirt specific AI and feed, I don't know how many, I think we're at like 75 to 80,000 articles from Tech Dirt over the years. And they were going to feed all of them and create a Tech Dirt AI, but I never really followed up with them, but I should.
Yeah. You could turn that into a kind of life-sized mic that follows you around and tells you what's happening with the latest court cases in the US.
Gosh. I
one for the
fear
future.
that.
We've got a lot to get through today. We've, like you say, had a number of really interesting kind of late-breaking stories as the week's gone on. But yeah, we wanted to pay testament to the readers and listeners who've sent in their reviews and given us 5-star ratings on various different platforms this week. Turns out there are people out there, Mike, and they listen.
Yes.
They're empathetic to our pleas, which is nice. Is there any that caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you. Obviously, it's great to get the feedback, even if I had to hound you last week. But you know, we're really happy with the reviews. We got a bunch of 5-star reviews. We got one 4-star review, but it was still very nice, and so that's fine. We're not telling you, what you have to do, but people said some nice stuff, calling it a must listen to, which is great, and people talking about how we talk about a pretty wide range of issues having to do with technology and speech, and so I was pretty happy with the reviews. We'll also note we got some critical feedback, which we also appreciate. We're always happy to hear some stuff. I think we wanted to just mention, one of the things that we are trying to do with this podcast is not just have it be about speech issues in the US and Europe. We always try and make sure that we're getting things from around the globe and highlighting stuff that the world is bigger than just the US and Europe, even though that is where Ben and I are located. Mm-hmm. And that also means that sometimes we won't have as much direct knowledge of specifics or nuances of a particular country or region. And we absolutely welcome a constructive criticism on that, or nuance or specifics. And, we try to talk to people in those countries when we can. We'll potentially try in the future to have some more folks from around the world on the podcast in the future as well. But, sometimes we don't know everything, and we are open to folks letting us know. And so we did get some constructive criticism, I would say, last week about our coverage on Brazil. And we appreciate it. And we appreciate any other feedback that people have as well.
Indeed. And if you want to send us an email with your thoughts, podcast@Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. If you're interested in becoming a co-host for an episode of the podcast in the future, drop us a line. We've already had a couple of different co-hosts who've got in touch directly who aren't people we know directly. So there's really lots of opportunities to be involved. We want as many people with a diverse range of experiences and views to be on the podcast in the future. So consider this your opportunity to get in touch. As per your summarizing, Mike, we've got a range of stories on today, some from the US, some from further afield, a big story that I'll be talking about in South Korea as well. So lots to get into. But yeah, thanks everyone for the recommendations, for the reviews, and for the stars. So let's start off, Mike, with on your side of the Atlantic, with the story that could be, if you're a kind of pencil aficionado, you might think this is about pencils. It's not. HB18 is a
that was a reach. Well, okay.
That's my kind of graphically inspired intro. Talk us through HB18, also known as the Securing Children Online Through Parental Empowerment Act. Natalie named there.
Yes, yeah. This is a law that was passed in Texas. It was actually passed last year, and it is one of a number of laws that a number of states have passed focused on protecting the kids online. And obviously there's been a lot of debate about that around the globe. And in the US at the federal level, there's been obviously the ongoing debate about the Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA. And in the interim, while that debate has been going on, a bunch of states have passed different laws. We talked about California and its age-appropriate design code. Texas last year passed HB 18, which is also a law that is designed, they say, to protect the children. And it had a bunch of requirements in there around age verification and then how certain social media websites would have to deal with different specific types of content that the state deemed to be harmful to children, whether it was eating disorders or grooming, harassment, a variety of things of that nature. That law was set to go into effect September 1st, this month, just last week, this week, I guess, depending on
when you're listening.
Yes. And like about a little over a month ago, CCIA and NetChoice stepped up and filed a lawsuit to try and block it. And so just right before the law was set to go into effect, it was in fact blocked by a district court judge in Texas who found that it almost certainly violated the First Amendment.
And just before we go into why, Mike,
yeah,
the lateness of the block, how comes that NetChoice and CCIA waited so long? How comes it's taken until now to happen?
I don't know for sure, but what I can say is all of these laws, so one, there's more than a dozen laws in different states that both CCIA and NetChoice mainly have been filing lawsuits to stop. And so that is a lot of work. Both of those organizations are relatively small organizations. And so they have to keep track of the dozens of laws that are being passed. And a lot of it is just looking at when they go into effect. I have obviously no inside knowledge on this at all, but my sense, given the timing of the various lawsuits, is that they're looking at when they're scheduled to go into effect and scrambling to make sure that they push for an injunction before the law goes into effect. So we had the same thing. There was a law that was supposed to go into effect earlier this year in Ohio. And so a few weeks before it was supposed to go into effect, they filed there. So I think it's just based on the timing of when the law is supposed to go into effect and then just the general busyness of the organizations and their legal teams. And
Got it. Okay,
my sense is it was the September 1st deadline, even though the law was passed last year, the fact that it wasn't scheduled to go into effect until September 1st. Some of it also may have been they were kind of waiting to see what happened with the NetChoice cases at the Supreme Court and other things in terms of if that gave anything useful for blocking these laws.
Right.
And so I would imagine that was part of it. So they filed, I think at the end of July is when they filed. And then right before the law was set to go into effect, the ruling came out and they put the law on hold and basically said that it is likely to violate the First Amendment.
Okay.
I see this case as there are a bunch of other issues here, right? So it's a few years ago, Texas had passed its social media content moderation law, which was part of the net choice cases at the Supreme Court, which we now refer to as Moody because it's not worth getting into why, but that's the Moody cases, which also impact Texas, even though Moody is Florida. Doesn't matter. That was a case about regulating social media. Texas also had this other law around age verification for adult content websites or websites that had more than 30% adult content, depending on how you determine that. And that case was also in the district court, was found to be unconstitutional. With both of those laws originally found in the district court, found to be unconstitutional, Fifth Circuit, in the way that only the Fifth Circuit can, reversed on both of those, making a whole bunch of nonsense in the process. So 2 years ago, that was around the social media moderation. That case went to the Supreme Court. The one that we had a few months ago, Moody, basically saying the Fifth Circuit was absolutely crazy, sending the case back. Please reconsider. That is now happening. The second case was the age verification for adult content. Again, thrown out, district court, unconstitutional. Fifth Circuit, no, this is totally fine. Now the Supreme Court is hearing that case. So that was, recently taken up by the Supreme Court. It'll be heard this fall. Who knows when we'll get a ruling? Sometime next year on that. Some of that is backdrop to this case because there is an age verification component to HB 18, and how the courts will handle it will probably depend very much on what happens with the Supreme Court. But the other stuff around filtering content and saying kids can't access certain content, here again, the judge, and I will note that this is the same judge who got this case, who had the case about the first law around moderating social media. And I actually find it's interesting that very few people mention the fact that that original law around moderating social media in Texas was one that basically said social media can't moderate. It's against free speech for social media to do any moderation.
Right.
Was the overall message of that law. This law is, oh my God, children, how could you not be moderating? And so there is some sort of mental conflict there that you would think some people would realize, but nobody does. So apparently moderation is bad for adults, unless it's really adult, in which case there has to be moderation, or if they're kids, in which case all bad content must be deleted.
Yeah, try and thread that needle if possible.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see, it was pretty strong ruling, pretty thorough. I think this judge knows what's likely to happen with the Fifth Circuit, which is that, again, it's probably going to do something stupid. But I think the judge wants to set a pretty clear record and wants to be very clear about it. One thing he also did, which I thought was interesting and we hadn't seen in some of the other cases, was he said that this law is preempted by Section 230. This has come up in a bunch of the different state laws. Section 230 is very clear that no state law can basically undo Section 230. So any state law that is in conflict with Section 230, Section 230 wins. And therefore, and it's been brought up in other cases and the judges have generally ignored it or just sort of said, I'm not going to deal with this now. Most of these laws around content moderation that tell companies how they have to moderate, whether take down more stuff or keep up more stuff, violates Section 230 and should be preempted by the law, saying this law, you can't go into effect because the federal law blocks that.
Interesting. I'm gonna play my dumb Brit card now.
Yeah, go for it.
And
that's why you're here.
or dumb person card, however you want to see it. Why do any states bring cases that they know are going to be preempted by Section 230 eventually anyway?
Well, either they don't understand Section 230, which is a common theme that goes through everything in the U.S. around Section 230, is that people just don't understand it. The second element of it is that they are hoping that because there is a sort of judicial dislike for Section 230 right now, I think they think that judges will ignore it. And as I said, a lot of the courts have effectively not paid attention to the preemption arguments, partly because of the timing of the cases. Like preemption is the kind of issue that might come up later in some of those cases, or they just think they can get around it. They think it's something different. They say it doesn't conflict. I do remember there was this funny moment where one of the authors of the first social media content moderation bill, the one that was at stake in the Paxton Moody net choice cases, he went on Twitter and had said, we wrote this law so that it doesn't conflict with Section 230. And he had this interpretation that was basically, this law is useless. The law goes into effect, but if it's used in a way that conflicts with Section 230, that that's not what the law is meant to do. And I was like, the only thing the law does is in conflict with 230. It was a very weird moment. But I think a lot of it's just like people just don't understand Section 230. And so they think that they can pass these laws and they'll get around it. Or they don't care because it's all about culture war, messaging, grandstanding, be on the front page of the paper, protecting the children kind of thing.
Okay, fine. And are there particular aspects of this law that the ruling kind of pulls out? Because it's very broad, obviously, scope. And can you kind of give us a sense of like what they had particular issues with? Because I suppose that's where we kind of maybe see some patterns with other rulings as well.
Yeah. So, I think it was actually really interesting. I mean, the judge is very thorough and kind of went through it and basically said that there was a lot of stuff that was vague. This is always an issue, that when you're talking about regulating certain types of content, first of all, that is going to require First Amendment scrutiny. And, people seem to think that like, oh, well, we can just ignore the First Amendment because like this content is bad. But the court made it clear that like you can't just put in like vague stuff. So, for example, it said that you had to stop content that promoted, glorified, or facilitated certain types of harm.
Mm-hmm.
And the judge was like, what does that mean? Promote, glorify, facilitate could be all sorts of stuff, right? And so there's a line that said, to glorify potentially includes any content that favorably depicts a prohibited topic, leaving no clear answer on what content must be filtered. Do liquor and beer advertisements glorify substance abuse? Does Othello glorify suicide? Like, these are the types of things it's saying, like, a lot of people, when they write these laws, there is this sense, and this is true of people all the time, people who sort of comment on social media, content moderation, trust and safety issues. There's this sense of like, well, it must be easy. You stop the bad stuff and you let the good stuff go, as if that's like really clear. And it's not. So it's easy to say like anything that promotes, glorifies, or facilitates eating disorders, for example, or self-harm seems bad. But as the judge says, like, well, Othello, is that glorifying suicide? Arguably, yes, right? But like, we think that is artistic and not something that should be blocked.
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of the sort of First Amendment issues come in here. And so it was sort of good to see him calling all of those things out.
Right. So this is kind of a ruling that kind of falls foul of the like awful but lawful distinction to an extent. And I think, you mentioned there about how this is the third kind of major ruling that it's had kind of go against it. But you also, before we started recording, talked about how this is not the first state trying to bring a kind of child safety ruling and to have had that blocked. So it's like happened in other states as well, right? We kind of,
I mean,
this is another pattern.
Yeah. And so the things that I've noticed over the last few years is like the attempts to regulate the internet. It's funny how like the states and the federal government are all sort of feeling their way around and testing like different things to say like, can we do something that probably violates the First Amendment without it violating the First Amendment? Like everybody's trying to find like the secret path through to regulate internet speech that doesn't violate the First Amendment. And so the latest thing, there's sort of these two elements to it, one of which is like these kids code ideas where it's like, well, kids are different and therefore we can put these regulations in there that require sites to treat kids differently, which first of all leads to like questions about age verification and privacy for kids and all of that. And that is now being somewhat tested at the Supreme Court. We'll see what else comes of that. And the other thing is like these, you're sort of trying to pretend that we're talking about design as opposed to content. We saw that with California and the age appropriate design code that we talked about a few weeks ago. That got thrown out again for First Amendment reasons. The other angle, and this leads us into sort of the next thing that we want to talk about a little bit, is that there's an element of transparency. People think, well, if we just require the companies to be more transparent about their moderation impacts, like maybe that is a way to get around the First Amendment. And in fact, the laws, the Texas and mainly the Florida law that was part of the Moody case had a transparency element to it, which the courts had said was okay. And that the 11th Circuit in particular said the transparency part is fine. So California also passed a similar law that had a transparency mandate for trust and safety for terms of service in terms of how they moderate certain types of content that required different reports, and claimed that this was not about taking down First Amendment speech, just wanted you to send to the Attorney General how you were dealing with specific categories of potentially problematic speech. And that law was also thrown out this week by the 9th Circuit. This is the appeals court. It had actually, there have been a few different folks have challenged it. The original challenge actually came from users on Twitter who I would say, are not great users. You have like the Babylon Bee and Tim Pool, who's in the news this week for something else that we might talk about later,
Indeed.
who sued California saying that this law was going to pressure companies to take down their content, which actually might be true. But the court in that case said that they didn't have standing to sue, and so dropped that lawsuit. It was a very poorly done lawsuit. I think what happened, because almost immediately after it got thrown out, a few weeks later, Twitter, or X, as we are now unfortunately forced to call it, filed a suit challenging that law using Floyd Abrams, very famous First Amendment lawyer, one of the big names in First Amendment law in the US, and challenged that law, saying like the transparency requirements violated its First Amendment rights. And the lower court rejected that and said, nah, it's fine. But now the Ninth Circuit on appeal said, yeah, actually, this law clearly violates the First Amendment, and mostly threw it out. There's parts of it that it's sort of sent back for further analysis, and basically says this law is mandating speech. It's compelled speech by the company that they might not want to do. It points out that there's this very confused standard in the US. There was a case in the 80s, Zaudera, on mandating transparency around advertising for professionals, where the court basically said you can, if it's advertising and it's for non-controversial factual content, you can do it. But a lot of courts and a lot of lawmakers have taken that Zaudera ruling to say, oh, transparency is fine. We can make any company be transparent, which is, I think, a very broad ruling. But the courts have sort of not really dug that deeply on it. This one starts to, but does so in a slightly weird way. It doesn't go into the full Zaudera analysis, but actually says that the Zaudera ruling is dependent on the idea that commercial speech is okay to regulate more readily than non-commercial speech.
Right.
But in this case, the court said it's not commercial speech, that this is speech about speech, which is an interesting phrase. And this is not the company speaking for itself for commercial reasons. This is the government forcing it to talk about its speech on the platform and how it moderates it. And therefore, it does not qualify as commercial speech. And so it is still compelled speech, not under commercial reasons. And therefore, we don't need to even do the Zaudera test. And then because it's compelled speech, it requires what's called strict scrutiny to review it. And it doesn't pass strict scrutiny, and that this goes way overboard in terms of what you can compel a website to reveal. And so
interesting.
Between these two cases, the two main ways that a lot of lawmakers and activists, frankly, think that they can get around the First Amendment with design codes and with transparency laws, we have two courts this week saying, no, actually, we see that you're trying to get around the First Amendment, and really you're sort of trying to tap dance in a way that you are forcing companies or pressuring companies to take down certain types of content, and that requires First Amendment scrutiny, and you're not doing enough to meet that.
Yeah, so kids code, transparency, not having the desired effect for some states bringing these laws. It's interesting, obviously, in Europe, within the DSA, both of those things are present. And we're therefore starting to see, I guess, where the fault lines are between, obviously, the European approach to regulation, which is several years further ahead, I'd say, and then where the US is landing on this stuff. Where do you think states will start to then push a little harder? Like, if it's not these areas, do you see other areas emerging? Are there other rulings that might tell us more?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're still working on this and sort of trying to figure out the path through. And some of it is still going to be determined by how all these Supreme Court cases come down. Obviously, the age verification part of it is a big part of it. So that case is going to be super important. And then the Moody case is going to bounce around again because we still haven't quite figured out what is and what is not allowed. I think everyone is just going to keep pushing and testing and trying to figure out how this goes. I would imagine that California is going to try and appeal this particular ruling. You know, it is interesting that it was, in this case, X that brought this case, because my sense, and this is totally vibes, this may not be true. My sense was that with this transparency law, that the big tech companies were actually perfectly happy with it. They knew that they were in perfect compliance with the transparency law. And if anything, all it did was create a compliance burden for smaller companies. And the big companies don't really care about the smaller companies that much, and actually don't mind the fact if there's a bigger compliance burden, because that's a sort of competitive advantage for the bigger companies. So it is interesting that it was X that was willing to challenge this law, because without that, the transparency aspects of these laws might have just gone into effect. without anyone seriously challenging them until much later. And so it's interesting to see just sort of how that plays out. But I would imagine, especially because you have a lot of like civil society folks and certainly academics who are really big for totally understandable reasons, pushing on the transparency and saying like, we want transparency. And from my standpoint, I keep arguing like transparency is a really good thing, and we do need more transparency. I worry about the mandated transparency, which, is like this, I want more transparency, but when the government says you have to be transparent about this, I actually think it can create real problems. And in fact, the California law 587, I think, was a terrible transparency law if that was what you wanted, because among other things, it had these rules about like how often you could change your terms of service. And anyone who does trust and safety knows like changing policies happens all the time because bad actors change how they act. And also like you have to be kind of careful in what you do publicly reveal, because bad actors use that as a roadmap for getting around your policies. And if you have to be really public about it and you can't change it that quickly, you're sort of giving not just a roadmap, but like a time period for bad actors. So it's saying, here's the roadmap and I can't do anything about it for like a month. So have at it.
It's the worst of both worlds.
Yes. Yeah. And so, I think that there are ways to do transparency, to incentivize companies to do transparency better without mandating it. And I wish that was the focus, sort of incentivizing rather than mandating, but we're not there yet.
Okay. Really useful, helpful unpacking and kind of knitting together some of those rulings that we've talked about in the last few weeks, Mike. We'll move on now to our kind of next story, which is one I've been following for the last couple of weeks out of South Korea. I'm going to kind of explain a little bit, Mike, how this story came to be, because there's been a couple of developments over the last few weeks. But essentially, South Korea, last week, the president of South Korea announced a 7-month campaign to combat what it calls digital sex crimes, the kind of epidemic that has been taking place in the country over a number of years now. The latest version of it has seen deepfake images of women be created and traded and in some cases sold via platforms and messaging services. And the reason why the president kind of talked to the media and talked publicly about this is because in the last 8 or 9 months, they've seen a significant uptick in the number of crimes related to deepfake images from a small base, but significantly higher than the last few years. And it's also been discovered that there are large Telegram channels of up to 220,000 people in some cases using, creating, trading deepfake images. And that's bad enough, but this comes on the back of a rough few years for this story in South Korea. So I hadn't heard about it until I started digging into it. Mike, you might have heard about it, but there was a story in 2020 that came out about the use of Telegram to trade real images of women and girls that had been taken without the consent. The story was actually it was called The Nth Room. It was a collection of Telegram channels that was discovered by journalists. And essentially the scam was that several men and then a group of men, as it got bigger, essentially persuaded women who were interested in becoming models to share non-consensual imagery with them, and sometimes consensual imagery that was then used to blackmail them. And the images and the photos are then sold often via Telegram, often using cryptocurrencies. And so this was a huge network of blackmail and NCII, and it heralded a massive public outpouring. It heralded a number of new laws in South Korea that made the process illegal. And the guy who organized the Telegram channels, who called himself God, which kind of tells you all you need to know about this guy's character, he was sent to jail for, I think, 42 years. So there has been a kind of long-standing history in South Korea of this kind of story, this kind of thing happening. And Molka is this idea that it still exists in South Korea, where women are taken advantage of, they're taken, had videos taken of them in kind of voyeuristic situations, and there's a huge amount of misogyny in the country. The thing that's happened this week, on the back of that story where the president gets up and says that he's going to combat this scourge, is that Telegram, one of the central platforms in the story over a number of different years, has apologized. They have taken down 25 different pieces of content that the South Korean media regulator has asked them to take down over a number of different months. And they've set up a hotline where the government can also go directly to Telegram in order to have more, I guess, violating images pulled down, which is something that the Korean government had struggled to do previously. So this is a big U-turn.
Yeah.
And in and of itself, it's an interesting story. We talked last week about states versus platforms. And so this is a kind of another part of that puzzle. But it's also really interesting in terms of what's happening in France with the arrest of CEO Pavel Durov. And so I've unpacked that over a fair bit of time because I think it's interesting a number of different reasons. It's interesting because all of a sudden, following the arrest of the CEO of Telegram, they've started to react. Whether or not they're related, who knows? And then also I wonder if it's something that a path that we're going to see that case and those charges follow. What do you think about this, Mike, as a kind of adjacent story to that Durov case?
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing that really stood out, was that this happened right after the CEO is arrested. And in particular, even though, as we said last week, the charges are still not entirely clear what the exact charges facing Durov are in France, and Telegram had been forced to put out a statement saying, we comply with all laws, even though that is perhaps questionable, very questionable.
Yeah.
And yet, so here was this other story bubbling up in South Korea that was directed very much at Telegram. And suddenly they're just like, oh, we're really sorry, we're taking this content down. And by the way, here's a hotline how to call us. I don't think that happens if Durov is not arrested in France. And so I think this is very much whoever is currently running Telegram, and I guess Durov is, not in jail right now, but must remain in France. So he might have had something to do with it. But whoever is running it is saying like, maybe we should actually pay attention to governments when they're complaining about illegal content and figuring out a way to deal with it. And so you can't say what would happen in the alternative, but it certainly seems that this is Telegram perhaps reaching that realization that most companies realize a little bit earlier, which is that if you are hosting content and some of that content is illegal, then you need to have some way to deal with it. And the sort of like, come after us viewpoint, now that France has come after Durov, is making Telegram sort of wake up and maybe change its policies somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting as well, the slight differences between what's happening in France, and what's happened in South Korea. Because in France, it took the judiciary, as you talked about in last week's episode, there was a kind of case that was actually caused some political embarrassment for Emmanuel Macron, who has kind of long courted Pavel Durov, and I read this week was trying to get Telegram to move its headquarters to France. This actually the judiciary pulled his pants down a little bit by bringing these charges against him. Actually, it doesn't seem like that's what's happened in South Korea. No, there's been no kind of judicial case brought against Telegram. You've got the president talking almost directly to Telegram and imploring them to do something about it. So there are kind of slight nuances here, which I think are interesting. I was going to say, but I think in the context of what happened to Durov, like all of these things appear differently, right? I think Durov, honestly, is not unlike lots of other CEOs of speech platforms who, when they first come in, they think like, oh, we're just going to allow everything and like screw the government and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of a joke to them until I think France and the arrest made it real. And so now Telegram is like, oh, wait, we actually do need at least some sort of response. And so like if the next area where issues related directly to Telegram are popping up or South Korea, I'm sure they were just like, well, we got to figure out something to do here. And hey, maybe if that means taking down this clearly illegal content and issuing an apology and setting up a way for the countries to reach us. And so I think it totally makes sense. The question is, where does that go from here? Does Telegram set up a hotline for every country? And then you run into all sorts of issues where this is the slope that makes all of these issues very, very tricky, where you have the US letting companies know about problematic content, which then was turned into a whole thing here where it's like, oh, the government is violating the First Amendment and telling companies how to moderate, which isn't always the case. Or is it just alerting them to illegal content? Where do you draw the lines on all of these things becomes really tricky. And it's something that Telegram, if they want to remain a viable company that is not just a rogue, lawless entity,
is going to have to start to figure out, like, what are its policies on talking to governments and handling complaints about certain content. Because it's one thing to call out content that is clearly illegal, and CSAM is the obvious version of that. And then it just begins to get trickier and trickier in terms of which content is content that a government just doesn't like versus content that is directly illegal. A smart company, a thoughtful company with real trust and safety thought behind it, comes up with policies and ways to handle this. Telegram seems to be figuring it out and as it goes right now.
Yeah, almost 1 billion users in. Better late than never. And it's certainly going to increase the costs per user, right? Pavel Durov was saying in an interview with the FT last year, it only takes 70 cents to service each user per year. It's incredibly cheap. And if you set up a hotline in every country to deal with these kind of harms, that's going to change. So
yeah. And again, you see that there will be countries that will try to abuse that line. And so that's going to then be on the company to figure out how it deals with that.
Yeah, for sure. But it's a good example, continue on from last week, of the squaring off between kind of public and private, between kind of sovereign states and platforms. And I imagine the kind of states this week would have claimed victory, not just for this South Korea story, but also for what's happening in Brazil.
Yes. Nice transition.
Better than my pencil one. A lot has happened in the 7 days since we recorded last week.
So
we're going to do a kind of bit of a TikTok of what's happened, right? Just to kind of bring listeners up to speed.
Walk through really quickly. I mean, I think basically as we were recording last week, it was before the judge, Alexandra de Moraes, had issued the official order blocking X. And so that happened basically right after we recorded last week. We had already mentioned that he had started seizing some of the assets from SpaceX. That continued. So the original order to block X was kind of an interesting one in that it requires a bunch of different entities to do a bunch of different things. It required Google and Apple to remove X from the Play Store in Brazil. It required ISPs to block access to it. It required backbone providers to block access to it as well. So basically all up and down the stack, they were saying everyone is required, and it was the Brazilian telecoms regulator was in charge of enforcing that, had to figure out a way to block access. Now, there were a couple elements of it that were eyebrow raising for a lot of people. The first was, beyond telling Google and Apple to block the X app, it also said they had to block access to VPN apps that people could use to get around this, which is all of them, basically. I mean, the whole point of a VPN generally is to appear as if you're coming from somewhere else. It could be within your country, but it can also be in some other country. And so Apple actually had started to block VPN apps in its app store a few days earlier, which is curious, and I have not gotten an explanation for why. So in the Brazilian iOS app store, VPN started disappearing before this order came out. But a lot of people are like, that seems really aggressive. Obviously, there are lots of perfectly legitimate uses for VPNs, and in fact, very valuable uses for VPNs. And that order seemed very broad. A few hours later, he issued an amendment basically saying, I'm putting that part, just that part, on hold temporarily until the parties are heard from. I'm not even sure who the parties are exactly in that scenario. Is it X, or is it Google and Apple who are being told to block things, or is it the VPN companies? I don't know. But it was sort of, okay, we're not going to do that part. The other part that raised a lot of eyebrows, and people got confused, they thought the part that he backed away from on Friday was this part, but it wasn't, was that there was potential fines for users if they used a VPN to access X. Not just using a VPN, it had to be to access X. And the fines were effectively like $9,000 a day, is 50,000 reais. I'm not even sure how to pronounce the Brazilian currency, so I apologize for that. But that is also not unprecedented. A few years ago, when they blocked Telegram, bringing back Telegram, Brazil blocked Telegram for a few days, and they had 100,000 reais fine. So basically twice as much for anyone who used a VPN to access it. Though that block only lasted a few days and nobody ever enforced the VPN thing. But a lot of people were kind of up in arms about the VPN thing, which I think is legitimate to be concerned about. Then on Monday, a larger panel on the Supreme Court, I think it was 5 justices on the Supreme Court, reviewed the order and unanimously approved it. Moraes he didn't quite walk back the users of VPN fines, but basically said something to the effect of that it would only be enforced against sort of egregious uses of a VPN. I do know that a bunch of generally sort of right-wing Bolsonaro supporters, including like a few senators who are Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil, have been very clearly using a VPN, posting that we are using a VPN to sort of provoke and see what happens. We'll see what happens there. There was one justice on the panel who had proposed modifying the order to say that you could only be fined if you used a VPN to get on X and to then post racist, fascist, or other criminal content. But that wasn't approved by the other justices. There is now a push by some more right-leaning justices on the Supreme Court for the entire Supreme Court to rehear this to see whether or not they think it's legal. And so then most of the ISPs did what they said and started blocking X. So it became much harder to get to X very quickly. The one that held out was SpaceX, who has Starlink, which is used, not hugely used, but it is used, has a fair number of customers in Brazil. Famously, when Starlink launched in Brazil, Elon Musk had flown to Brazil and did a whole thing with Bolsonaro and said he was providing 19,000 Starlink things to go to schools around the country. It turns out that never happened. A reporter in Brazil revealed that was announced but never happened, even though on, I forget, Monday or Tuesday, Elon reposted a tweet that somebody posted saying, look how great Elon was for Brazil. He provided 19,000 Starlink things. That apparently just didn't happen, but he's happy to take credit for it because that's Elon.
To be fair, I do that all the time. Take credit for stuff that I didn't actually do.
But, so at first they announced publicly that they weren't going to block, and Elon made some noise about like sort of come and get us. He also declared that the US should seize the Brazilian president's plane because they had just seized the Venezuelan president's plane. And he said, like, we're going to get them to do that as retribution for seizing SpaceX assets, which, I mean, maybe if Donald Trump wins, then like he'll take orders from us. So who knows? But like, there's all sorts of craziness. And then just as that was coming to a head, SpaceX announced that, yes, they were actually going to block X and were implementing it, though they were doing so under protest. Though what someone else pointed out was that they could have protested under the law. They could have filed a legal protest, and they missed the deadline to do that, which is, when you fire all of your lawyers and all of your people who know how this works, that's something that might happen. And right now, it's just, it's still mostly blocked. People are getting around it with VPNs. And then sort of the Brazilian micro-blogging universe, which was a very large contingent of people. I've seen different numbers for how big they were on X, anywhere from 20 million to 40 million, but still a significant number of users.
Okay.
A lot of them have moved on. And there has been a big influx, and the reporting is a huge influx to Threads and to Blue Sky. And here's where we give a disclaimer. I am on the board of Blue Sky. I may be biased in anything I say here, but please be aware of that. Blue Sky had a huge leap. They've gained, last I checked, it was like 2.4 million new users. I think 85% of them were from Brazil. Portuguese has become a very big language on the platform over the last week. Has been a massive influx. And so it's been interesting to see how that's gone. The president of Brazil, Lula, has set up a Blue Sky account. And I will note, set up the personal domain. This is the way Blue Sky works for verification, that if you have control of a domain, that you can use that to verify that you're really real. We also saw the Supreme Court of Brazil set up their own domain as well on Blue Sky.
Okay.
And so it's interesting to see the sort of diaspora aspect of what happens when X gets blocked in that country.
And then, so the Starlink thing is interesting, right? Because Musk made a whole bunch of noise, said that he wasn't going to block X, and then did a U-turn.
Well,
and that's to do with the fact that the Supreme Court blocked Starlink's assets, right? We talked about it in last week's podcast.
Yeah, it's a little unclear. Like, Moraes had ordered that Starlink assets be seized, and Musk had responded to that and saying, everyone in Brazil gets free Starlink while this is happening because they couldn't take payments. And so that had something to do with it. And then apparently they were seizing equipment. There was also some report that I saw someone in Brazil had shared with me. There was an order to even maybe start seizing the gateways, the thing that you put up if you have a Starlink. Like they were going to go around, like, I don't know, home to home, seizing
putting them in a giant bag,
seizing the satellite receivers. And so I think probably, and I don't think Musk ever commented on the fact that SpaceX announced that they were going to comply with the law. My sense is that Musk just did what Musk did, which was speak, and then some cooler heads at SpaceX in the compliance and legal departments were like, I think we kind of have to comply with this. Otherwise, a lot of really bad stuff is going to happen.
Right.
And so they agreed to it. But, as of right now, it's still blocked and people don't really know what's going to happen. It's a big kind of open question.
Yeah. And all the while, as you might expect from Musk, he has been putting out court documents under the handle Alexandra files. He's made a big noise, shared a whole bunch of files and legal documents, claiming that there is no transparency from the court and that the people are being censored have no recourse to appeal. So there's it's a whole new kind of Musk psychodrama that's been unfolding this week.
Yeah.
Will probably continue over the coming weeks, right?
The one thing I'll say is some of the stuff that he's revealed in the Alexandra files they do look concerning to me, like just in understanding how things are done. But it's one-sided, and as we've seen with the Twitter files, I don't know that we can trust what we are seeing. They're not showing actual court documents. He's showing sort of their interpretation of the court documents and saying that certain people had to be blocked without it being revealed, like which tweets violated what law, and so there's no transparency there. And that is concerning, and including potentially having to take down content from a sitting senator in the Brazilian legislature. And so I understand why that's concerning, but again, we don't have the details, and so it is a little tough to say.
Yeah, okay. So 2 states this week kind of winning out in terms of the platforms, although maybe not winning out in terms of the effect on users in the long run, which is, I guess, really what we've got to keep an eye on. We're going to do a couple of additional smaller stories, Mike, as we often try to do. What else do you want to kind of flag this week?
Really quickly, I think this is an important case. It might not seem that way for people, specifically in trust and safety online speech case, but the Internet Archive lost a copyright case in the Second Circuit this week around its open library, which was this procedure where they scanned books and would let you take them out. And a lot of people looked at this and had a sort of knee-jerk reaction of clearly this must be copyright infringement. And the court said that it is. I think the argument is a little bit more complex. I think the court actually got this wrong, but I'm not the court. The court is the law. So, but what they were trying to do, and they had it very clearly laid out, was treat it very much like a library. So they would get books either by purchasing them or by donation. They would scan the books, make a digital PDF, kind of an ugly one, not a particularly useful one, and then they would lend it out. They would put the books into storage, but they would only lend out a 1-to-1 copy. So it was effectively no different than a library. If they had purchased the books themselves, as they had the possession of the books, they could have lent them out to people local, but they were making it available to people online. And it was very useful for lots of people, especially for researchers who just, couldn't get access to books otherwise. It's a huge library and gave access to a bunch of people. The publishers got upset and they sued. And they lost at the lower court, and now on appeal they lost as well. Basically, the court saying it wasn't fair use. And I think it's, there's something to be said that often gets lost in these questions about online speech of how much copyright actually is one of the biggest regulations regarding online speech, that often people don't think about it as a speech regulation, and yet it is. And one of the uses that came up in the case that I thought was relevant and made some of this point, which the court totally did not care about, was that one of the unique uses of this is it allows people, when they're writing online, to link to books or to link to a page in a book, just like you would link to another website or something. And that's a really useful feature that is done away with. And that was presented to the court as an example of how this is useful and transformative in ways that regular ebooks are not, licensed ebooks are not. And the court just dismissed it out of hand. And I think it's an example of where copyright really can come in and hinder open internet speech aspects. I don't want to go too deeply. There's a lot more to that case. I was really concerned about some of the language in the case where he basically, the judges, his 3-panel judges, said like, well, this is clearly, we're doing this for the public benefit, because if people could lend books for free or borrow books for free, authors will no longer want to write. And it's like, do they not know the centuries-long history of libraries? Like, those exist. Like, how do you ignore that? But, we don't need to get into it here, but it is worth remembering how copyright intersects. And many of the legal disputes that we're dealing with today are sort of echoes of copyright fights from 1, 2, 3 decades ago as well. So just noting that as a major case in the Second Circuit. I do expect that there will be an appeal. I don't know if it'll go to the Supreme Court. And if it does, I don't trust this particular Supreme Court to get it right. So I'm not happy with how that ruling came out, but it's one worth paying attention to.
Yeah, okay. One to keep an eye on and do some more reading on. We'll include a couple of links to that in today's show notes as well. And just finally, kind of interesting story that I noted this week, a pretty hefty policy decision out of the Oversight Board, the independent but Meta-funded group of experts who rule on content moderation decisions. As many of you will know, this is a decision that it made this week on the phrase "from the river to the sea," which is something that obviously many of us have come across in our kind of doings online since the October the 7th attacks last year now, and almost a year on. It's good to see that the Meta and Oversight Board have made a judgment on this. What they've done is that they've reviewed 3 cases involving the use of the phrase, and the board have found that they don't believe that it breaks any of Meta's rules on either hate speech, violence and incitement, or its dangerous organizations and individuals policy. And so this is obviously really notable because the conflict is ongoing. It's very obviously an emotive topic. It's something that where people obviously have strong perspectives. And by no means is the kind of Oversight Board the be-all and end-all when it comes to judging on this. But it's really important, I think, for us to note and cover this. They say that the content that they reviewed contains what they call contextual signs of solidarity with Palestinians, but no language calling for violence or exclusion. And there's no glorification or reference to Hamas, which is one of the organizations that is banned in the DOI policy that it has. And as such, in and of itself, as a standalone phrase, "from the river to the sea" is okay to use. They're obviously the use of the phrase in conjunction with other words that may violate those policies. The Oversight Board are very clear to say would not be acceptable. But it's kind of notable that in and of itself, it's okay. This comes on the back of obviously a long, quite checkered history that Meta have with moderating speech related to the conflict. The Sheikh Jarrah protests, which we've talked about on the podcast in the past, triggered an independent review which found that Meta on its platforms was not sufficiently well placed to moderate Arabic speech. And that has not really changed a great deal over the last few years. So it is interesting, again, that this is the way it's landed. So I think there's more to dig into here. We haven't got time today to really dig into this particular ruling, but it's an interesting thing that the Oversight Board have come back and said.
I mean, the one thing I'll say about it is that it's a really good representative, very fraught representative of like the impossibility of content moderation on these issues, because there are people who hear that phrase and say there's no way that is not violent, because the only potential way that you could read that is that you're trying to wipe out the Jewish people of Israel. So it's one of these things where the context of the speech is very, very important, and people hear it differently based on where they are and who they are and what their situation is. And there's a lot of speech like that. This is just a very clear example of it, where, again, it feels easy to say, take down the bad stuff, leave up the good stuff. But this is very good to some people. It's very bad to some other people. And it very much depends on their perspective. And there's no right answer that says this speech is always okay and it's not. And what the Oversight Board here is trying to walk this balance that is itself impossible, because no matter what they say, there are many people who are still going to say like that is absolutely violent, and there are many people who are going to say it is not violent at all. It is a message of solidarity. And so to me, it's just a really great representative of the impossibility of having to moderate speech like this.
Yeah, and that is with a group of people who are experts in the field, making their best judgment with the evidence they have. That's probably a useful note to end on, Mike, the impossibility of moderation and the difficulties of online speech. Thanks as ever for your time and bringing those stories today. I really enjoyed talking through what will forever be known as the pencil ruling in my head, and really, really really glad to have talked through some of the issues in South Korea as well, which I think we will come back to in forthcoming weeks. Appreciate everyone's joining us today. Thanks as ever for your time, for listening, and for your reviews and ratings on our platforms. If you like the podcast, if you enjoyed today, don't forget to spend a bit of time going there and rating us. It does really help us get recommended and found on the platforms. And we'll speak to you next week. Thanks all for joining.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.